was interesting is when Glenn Tompkins was interviewing at the Satchmo Fest, Cotton, I think it's with Warren Cotton. I probably have the name of Walter Cotton. I'm not sure if I have the musician, 95 years old, and she's asking him to recollect. Well, she, in some ways, her ability, she was so agile at being able to get him to build on things where initially his answer was pretty minimal, and stark. And then she was able to get him to build on that, which I think Amy and I were talking about, that talent and gift and ability.
Yeah.
But I always thought for the NPR interviews that they would spend time with you ahead of time.
So one time I was on All Things Considered, I did do a pre-interview, but that was a rare. That's not typical.
So that's not commonplace.
No.
Okay, no. Interesting to know.
Well, I think that interview that Glenn Tompkins did was really tough.
I did
He's
too.
95 years old.
Yeah.
Honestly, he couldn't recall a lot. Right?
Yeah.
And so she teased out what she could from him,
And offered context herself.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think some part of the reason why his answers were short is because he couldn't quite remember everything.
Yeah.
So, in the detail that you might want or expect. But she did good. She was so personable.
Yeah.
Clearly, she prepared.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have known it. But it was so.
And I had known about her for years living in California because she was one of their correspondence bearers. So when I moved here and I heard that she was doing Music Inside Out and she had returned to her home in New Orleans, it was like, oh my
She was
God,
with the West
she
Africa.
is a treasure. I mean, that we
She's going to
actually.
be a PhD student in our grad program starting this fall.
Oh,
Oh, great.
all right. Well, let us know when we're ready.
Yep, we're ready when you are. I have the little banner running already, so we're technically live, but they can't hear us. So yeah, let me get here and I'll take that banner off, and you'll actually be able to see what you see in the camera. There is what they're seeing.
Okay.
Ready?
Let's go. All right. Well, welcome. I'm Amy Irvin, your host and moderator for today's Author Talk, offered by Creative Community League, an initiative utilizing cultural strategies for movement building, supporting artists, storytelling, and other dynamic community involvement in moving reproductive and sexual awareness into creative spaces. See our Facebook and Instagram pages for all of our projects. The Author Talk series hosts local authors and academics writing about issues important to women and families in Louisiana and the Gulf South. Our next discussion will be held on Monday, September 26th with Robin Marty, author of Handbook for a Post-Roe America. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by friend and colleague Carissa Hagerberg to discuss Women Against Abortion, inside the largest moral reform movement of the 20th century. Carissa Hagerberg is an associate professor of history at Tulane University, where she teaches courses about U.S. women's and gender history and the history of medicine in the U.S. She is the author of Women Against Abortion, Inside the Largest Reform Movement of the 20th Century, published in 2019. She also co-edits the popular textbook Women's America, Refocusing the Past, published by Oxford University Press. Her research has been supported by grants from the state of Louisiana, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library, Duke University Libraries, and the Newcomb Institute at Tulane University. She is completing a book on the history of American nursing since 1964. At Tulane, she supervised Students United for Reproductive Justice. She currently advises a student group that organizes sober social events open to all Tulane students. So again, welcome. Glad to have you.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for doing this.
Of course. So there are many unsavory and reprehensible women in this book. I'm thinking particularly about Shelley Shannon, who shot and wounded Dr. George Tiller at his clinic in Wichita, Kansas in 1993. She then maintained a 16-year friendship from her prison cell with Scott Roeder, who killed Dr. Tiller in his church in 2009. So these are the types of folks that we'll be talking about. But before we turn our attention to Shannon and other women in the book, I'd like to know a little more about you.
Okay.
Were you raised in an anti-abortion household? And what were your parents' political and religious views?
So I was raised in northern North Dakota, and at the time, North Dakota wasn't such a conservative state the way that it is now. It was actually pretty middle of the road. Our senators and U.S. Congress people tended to be Democrats, whereas the state legislature was dominated by Republicans. And that split was reflected in my own home. My father was a Republican and my mom a Democrat. But my father was more of an old school Republican, believing that the government shouldn't interfere with people's personal lives. So kind of like more of a libertarian when it came to social issues. And my mom was very openly a feminist and very pro-choice, and like very assertive about that in an area where most people were not very assertive about their feminist identities. And so I grew up going to my father's side of the family, which was more conservative, and navigating that, and then my mother's side of the family, which were like communists, much more progressive. And so I've always like understood how to, I think, navigate both worlds and to have a sensitivity for both groups. Yeah, my household was like my parents were Methodist. Like they were pretty progressive, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Women Against Abortion traces the history of women in American anti-abortion movement starting in the late 1960s through the 1990s. As a historian, what interests you about this time period in U.S. history, and these women particularly?
Okay, so a few things. One is that as part of my identity and my belief in feminist scholarship, I think that we have an obligation to show women as being just as complicated as men. And so if we're only telling stories in which women are the heroes of the story, I think we're missing something. And so there's just been this like flourishing of scholarship lately on women's investment in the slave trade, for example. The women's roles in opposing desegregation. They were among the most powerful people in their communities, often under the veneer of motherhood, wanting to protect their children. And when it came to abortion, when I was in graduate school, I just saw this disconnect that just didn't feel right to me, of people describing the anti-abortion movement as a bunch of men telling pro-choice women what to do. And one of the things that I speculate in the book is that it made for good TV to have like a male white minister having an argument often with an African-American pro-choice woman, right? Like it looked like this, like, look at these opposites in so many ways. And so it made for good dramatic television. But when I started doing more research, and especially into these crisis pregnancy centers, I found that women just overwhelmingly dominate the movement in the volunteer corps. They may not always be the leaders, but for rank and file members, they completely dominate.
Mm-hmm. Most of us are probably familiar with well-established national anti-abortion organizations like the National Right to Life Committee or Americans United for Life. These women didn't affiliate with these organizations, but instead worked at the grassroots level. Why was that?
Yeah, so that's an important question. So many of them tried. They tried to become leaders in the National Right to Life Committee, and found it very difficult. Like they hit a glass ceiling, and like there are a couple of ways to think about this. One could be like, what did you expect? You joined this patriarchal movement. Did you really think that these guys were going to let you flourish? But another way of looking at it is like, isn't that kind of how all many groups were, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, that like even in progressive organizations, women didn't make it to the top. So I don't want to malign the anti-abortion movement as being unusually sexist with regard to hiring and promotion and that sort of thing. But also, a lot of these women sensed, and they were actually right about this, that the anti-abortion movement was setting itself up for failure by emphasizing so much the rights of fetuses. So a lot of women, beginning in the late 1960s, 1970s, said, you know, we need to have a different approach if we're going to like persuade people who don't really have much of an opinion on abortion. We need to start depicting ourselves as people who like women, who want to help women, who perceive women who are pregnant as being potential victims or being helpless. And so it was that group of anti-abortion women working at the grassroots who opened the first crisis pregnancy centers. And they started to offer just this different vision for how to depict women. Rather than being sinful killers of their babies, instead they're these poor, vulnerable victims who need a lot of help.
And there's been a lot of talk recently about crisis pregnancy centers. Like Louisiana recently did a report about the prevalence of CPCs in the country and here in Louisiana. Storytelling is a tactic employed by both the pro-choice and anti-choice or anti-abortion movements. You write that the 1980s marked the emergence of the anti-abortion regret tracts, stories from women who regretted their abortion. Why are regret tracts important to the anti-abortion movement?
Yeah, so for several different reasons. So it became really popular for these like anonymously written tracts to be printed in Christian publications, and they always went a little something like this. I had descended into a life of drinking and drug use and promiscuity, and then I realized I was pregnant, and my boyfriend, he said he would give me money to get an abortion, but nothing more. And he drove me to the clinic. And then I got the abortion. And then afterward, I saw a vision of Jesus. And I immediately began weeping. And I knew I had killed my baby. And I told Jesus, yeah, I will spend the rest of my life warning other women not to commit the sin that I did, if you will forgive me. Like, what I just described is like some version of that got printed over and over again, usually by anonymous. And then over time, women started to come forward and publicly admit to this sort of story. And for them, they got to like go on the speaking circuit, and there would be like groups of church groups who might convene in like rural Minnesota, and it could be hundreds of these women, maybe like Catholics or Baptists from around the region who would convene. And one of these women might be flown in from like Wichita or Denver. And so the whole thing is really interesting because the woman who gets flown in to tell her story, her redemption story, her entire career is predicated on like saying over and over again what a sinner she is or was. So she's sullied goods in a sense, according to Christian or a very conservative Christian interpretation of this woman. On the other hand, these women who otherwise would never have maybe had opportunities to travel or be celebrities within Christian circles were very much valued for their story. Like people would be in tears by the end of their story and be clapping for them. So it became a source of self-esteem and prestige within the movement. But it also then could be taken as evidence that women are harmed by abortion. So again, these are anecdotes, but they're very powerful, emotionally powerful anecdotes. And people took them as evidence that abortion was emotionally harmful for women.
And you write that it allowed women who had had premarital sex to come back into the fold and give them leadership roles within the movement.
Right. But the question always is, like, how far could they advance? Because, again, their entire role within the movement is predicated on their past of being, like, fallen women, essentially.
Additionally, Catholics and evangelical Protestants have different philosophical views about the most effective strategies to end abortion. Julie Lesh, a progressive Catholic, bridged these two strains of the anti-abortion movement. Who was she?
Yeah, so I think of Julie Lesh as being kind of a tragic figure in the anti-abortion movement. She got her start, like a lot of Catholic women in high school, protesting against the Vietnam War. Like, so that's what made her politically energized. And after that, like, she got involved with labor organizing. She was in one of Cesar Chavez's daughter's weddings as a bridesmaid. Like, she went to Antioch College in Ohio, so she had like all these like progressive bona fides. But according to her, after abortion was legalized, she was in Pennsylvania, which is where she was born, and there was like a conference, the governor's conference on the status of women was going on, and like she just went to check it out, and there were some anti-abortion protesters there, and like women, she called them like the ladies with the roses, and so she went up and talked to them, and according to her, she had this revelation that like if she opposes the destruction of life in Vietnam, if she cares about poverty, then she should also care about fetal life, that all of this was connected. And this was given shape by this one Cardinal Bernardin in Chicago. He came up with what was called the seamless garment philosophy, that that Catholics have an obligation to protect life from conception to death. So she thought that like this could be a good feminist issue, that like so she just thought that all of her liberal friends would go with her, and they didn't, and they weren't, and so she thought like I need to come up with something more creative. So she formed this organization that was dedicated to opposing nuclear proliferation and opposing abortion, called Pro-Lifers for Survival, which like no one understood what that meant. And so it like never really took off. But they did all sorts of like these stunts. Like they in the early 1980s they went to the Pentagon and like spilled fake blood. And they wanted to bring attention to like the Pentagon is evil for supporting war and we oppose abortion. So like again, no one ever understood what they were about.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think she represents this like kind of lost moment. Like there was never going to be a place for her in the anti-abortion movement. And this is where I think it gets tragic. So she was a great organizer. She had all this experience in these other movements. So she like understood how to create like a list, how to like activate people, how to create a good like a catchy newsletter. And very quickly, like the early organizers of Operation Rescue, who were like these evangelical men, saw in her like this incredible organizing talent. So they hired her right away. And they basically just took from her like all these strategies for like how to construct a listserv, how to have a really like flashy event that will attract the press to come take pictures of whatever shenanigans they're doing. And as soon as they extracted all this information from her, they basically just totally cut her out. So they stopped inviting her to high-level meetings. She never got a promotion. So she like quit, like very disillusioned with that movement.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit more about that, but before we do, I want to acknowledge that she becomes a leader in the anti-abortion movement, helping to organize We Stand Up, a national anti-abortion protest to coincide with Pope John Paul II's 1987 visit to the United States. It was a pivotal moment for her and the anti-abortion movement. Why was that?
So for a few reasons, like it really brought together evangelicals and Catholics. So like the movement had always been regarded as a Catholic movement, and suddenly like you had evangelicals showing up like for this celebrity pope, and I think we forget how much of a celebrity Pope John Paul II was, and he was the one who I think was the first pope to have a Pope mobile. And so she just did this effective job of bringing everyone together, and they organized like these events in every city that he visited, and some were more successful than others. Like there was one where like they unfurled a banner, but like it didn't go down until like after the Pope had like driven by, so like there wasn't like the picture in the newspaper or anything.
Yeah, she was relatively disappointed
Yeah.
with the efforts, and particularly noted that there were a few African Americans present, Spanish speaking, or local activists weren't really didn't join up with the veteran activists, who were mostly white and Catholic still at this point. But the effort, as you say, and she as well, you alluded to this, she caught the eye of Terry Rendell of Operation Rescue, and he invites her to become a member. He gives her a job in communications. But in making that decision, she has to leave behind her Catholic social justice values to work with Protestant evangelicals, right? You write that many of the aggressive tactics scholars associated with evangelical pro-life men were transmitted by Catholic women who understood the anti-abortion protests to be an extension of their values. What was your experience working with Operation Rescue?
So I think she was incredibly disillusioned by the entire experience. Like she was treated, I think, really terribly by those evangelical men. But the one thing that I think if she were here and answering that question, she would point out the fact that she met her husband through her work in Operation Rescue. She ended up meeting and marrying an evangelical man. then she dropped out of the movement. There had always been this tension throughout her whole life because she was getting older and older and was unmarried and didn't have a child, and she felt like people were judging her or thought of her as a hypocrite because she was imploring other women to have babies. So like in her papers, she has like these diary entries in which she's just like completely beside herself about not having a boyfriend. And it's because she's in the anti-abortion movement where she's totally surrounded by women all the time. Like she has no opportunities to meet men. It's like women and then priests. And so finally, when like she joins this evangelical group, there are single men, and lo and behold, she meets her husband, and then so like it coincides with her being, blunted out of the movement. So she leaves Operation Rescue, gets married, and begins having children, and like lives in rural Tennessee, and is a big like homeschooling advocate now.
Can you talk a little bit more about Operation America? Operation Rescue.
Okay, so they're the ones who really spearheaded the campaign to have those massive rallies of like 10,000 people descending on Wichita, for example, which is where George Tiller practiced. And so, it's not, it's hard to talk about this in the wake of January 6th because we're seeing like the resurgence of these very large, very aggressive, male-dominated movements, and you see like those feel like echoes of Operation Rescue. Like they were much more aggressive in their documents, like in their posters, more aggressively and openly like anti-Semitic, and there was just like more muscularity to it. Like they were threatening violence, just overtly against providers. And so when we think about like it's almost like they're the master organization, that then there would be these offshoots of like Army of God, which were the smaller, like almost like terrorist cells that actually carried out bombings and things.
Mm-hmm. You write that some 60,000 people were arrested in Operation Rescue sponsored demonstrations during the late 80s and early 90s. You mentioned some of the tactics that they used. They were quite effective.
Yeah, and one thing that's kind of interesting about Operation Rescue is that there's like a Supreme Court case that they were involved in. It's the most commonly litigated case in the Supreme Court. Like it kept going back to the Supreme Court for reconsideration. It was a RICO suit that was brought against them by the Department of Justice. And RICO suits are usually brought against members of the mob. And so it was that they had this like shady funding scheme. And so it kept going back and forth with the court saying that yes, they have like nefarious funding. Ultimately, they won on like First Amendment grounds.
Mm-hmm. Despite Operation Rescue's effectiveness, both Loesch and the self-identifying feminists and Andrews left, another leader that you focus on in the book. Many of the women profiled in your book identified in some fashion as feminists, as you talked a little bit. How did rescuers like Andrews and Shelley Shannon square their roles as activists with their traditional role as Christian women and mothers?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the paradox of conservative activists, from like Phyllis Schlafly to the present. Like the very people who are, trying to encourage women to be mothers, and not be employed, are themselves making money by going out and giving speeches, and like delaying pregnancy and marriage and that sort of thing. So there's always this insecurity, and like one of the vignettes that I really like is that this one person who became prominent in the Reagan administration, her name was Marjorie Mecklenburg. She was married to a physician, and she like basically started the crisis pregnancy center movement in the United States. She had this journalist over to her home in the suburbs of Minneapolis, and she made sure to be like washing strawberries to make strawberry shortcake that day, like as she would. And she's just like, if any of my children were to need me, or if my husband were to have any qualms about what I'm doing, I would quit all my work in a heartbeat. And I mean, that's like almost verbatim what Phyllis Schlafly would say to journalists when they would like come into her home. And again, similarly, just like this wonderful acting, like Phyllis Schlafly would be like ironing shirts or something, something that she quickly would never have time to do.
You described some of the meetings as like Tupperware parties.
Oh yeah, so that was one of the strategies to recruit people into the movement is to have they modeled their parties on like Tupperware parties. So like, this is in the 60s and 70s. So they would invite like neighbors over to their home, and they would often like try to like invite one person from the community who maybe like contracted a disease like German measles or something like that during a pregnancy, and then they could be like, oh, everyone told me my child was going to be born defective. That was like the language at the time. And although Bobby is blind, I couldn't be happier. Like I love my child. So it was like again the importance of storytelling and having an anecdote to leave, like a powerful emotional anecdote to leave one of these house parties with, was just like this really effective strategy. So I think about this now when I think about the people who are into like is it Arbonne or something like that, like the like it's almost like the modern version of Amway, like the people who have those pyramid scheme parties at their house. I'm like, it is so similar. Like it's like recruit one person, hope that they'll host a party, that this will continue.
Well, your book ends in Kansas, where just last month voters rejected a proposed amendment to the state constitution that would allow the conservative Kansas legislature to further restrict or ban abortion. It failed by 18 percentage points, a remarkable victory for a conservative state associated with anti-abortion extremism. Let's go back to the early 90s. Can you describe the anti-abortion movement's assault on Dr. George Tiller and his Wichita, Kansas clinic?
Yeah. So Dr. George Tiller was one of a small number of physicians who was willing to perform abortions late into a pregnancy. And those occur for many different reasons, and I'm sure everyone here knows them. Like often it's like that there is a major fetal anomaly that the woman has experienced or the pregnant person is experiencing major health issues, or because of the proliferation of anti-abortion laws and regulations, people who may have wanted abortions earlier in their pregnancies have a difficult time raising the money or getting time off of work in order to get one in the first months of pregnancy. And Dr. Carhart is another person who does this. So he's like named in a lot of litigation. So these handful of doctors who perform these later term abortions are just like, they're so well known among anti-abortion activists. There are thousands of websites that have like wanted posters or targets with their names, faces, addresses, the names of their children, their spouses, everything. So he was a well-known figure. And again, Operation Rescue had staged these mass demonstrations in front of his clinic. And the person that I profile in the book, Shelley Shannon, was this longtime anti-abortion activist who also, I think, was a psychologically fragile person. And like a lot of extremist movements, take advantage of intellectually fragile people or emotionally fragile people. So she was living in Grants Pass, Oregon, disconnected from her family. She was living with her immediate family, but she had a traumatic childhood, and she was taken in by members of the Aryan Nation who taught her how to shoot guns. And she began this like vengeful trip throughout the United States. She went all the way like down California, detonating bombs, releasing acid and like this smelly stuff. I can't remember what it's called. Into like heating and cooling units at clinics, so that basically it smelled so bad that they had to like fumigate the place. But again, burning some down, and eventually made her way to Wichita, to Dr. George Tiller's clinic. And she caught him when he was like on his way out of the clinic, and he had a lot of bravado. Like he was a Republican, a member of the NRA, but he had this famous sign that said "Trust Women." So he kind of like a libertarian Republican, and he like raised both hands to flip her off when she approached him, and that probably saved his life because she ended up her bullets hit both of his arms, and they ended up being like grazed wounds. And so even though he probably was in enormous pain, he made a point of coming back to work the very next day. And she was arrested shortly after the shooting. And as Amy mentioned, after she was in prison, she maintained correspondence with Scott Roeder, who himself was this loner, disaffected guy. And I can't remember. You just read the book, and it's been a while for me. Did you ever visit her in prison, or was it just a pen pal
I
relationship?
think it was a pen pal
Okay.
relationship.
Yeah, and they exchanged like dozens of letters, and she told him, I need you to finish the job that I started. So I mean, it was like pretty explicit. And it basically like if you love me, it was the undertone of that.
She was found guilty of attempted first-degree murder for attacking Dr. Tiller and guilty of aggravated assault for pointing a gun at another clinic employee. And as you mentioned, she had gone on this terror across Oregon, California, and Nevada. Together she was sentenced for 31 years in prison.
And she's out.
I'm going to ask
Okay.
about that. First of all, what was her reaction to being sentenced? Because it was unusual for a woman to be charged and then sentenced for so long a period of time.
She was surprised, and because traditionally, like when women would get arrested, and then in the rare times when like charges would move forward, judges didn't know what to do with these anti-abortion women, or pretended like they didn't know what to do with them, and so they often just gave them light sentences. They just said like, "Oh, you're just like a brainwashed woman. Unfortunate you." It's like these judges were incredibly sexist in not being able to perceive these white Christian women as capable of it, and as actually having committed pretty brutal violence. And so one of the people I profiled, Joan Andrews, like she was incredibly violent and like committed so many crimes, like hundreds and hundreds of crimes, but like almost like charges were almost never brought. Like so, like she was initially arrested, but then just like let out. Or if she was sentenced, it would be for like time served or 30 days in just like the county jail. And so they're like, none of these women were really taken seriously. So I think she said something like, when he said 18 years or whatever it was, I couldn't believe he really meant 18 years. Like, and if I were her, I would be shocked too, because like that just didn't happen. Yeah.
And she refused to admit that she had committed any sort of violence or a crime at all.
Well, and that's a long-standing thing within the anti-abortion movement that they borrow from the civil rights movement. They argue that because the law is unjust, they haven't really committed a crime. And again, civil rights activists would offer that by saying like the law of segregation isn't, an unjust law. So it's a usurping of another movement's legal rationale.
As you mentioned, Shannon was to be released from prison in November of 2018. Was she, and is she still involved in the anti-abortion movement in some way?
I think she was released a year early, maybe for good behavior. And she served at that prison in Minnesota that's kind of famous for the guards don't use weapons of any sort. I know that during her term, she remained really actively involved. So there's an annual banquet called the White Rose Banquet, and it's a fundraising banquet to help the families of people who've been incarcerated for committing crimes. And so she would like knit booties, and so people would bid on Shelley Shannon's white knitted booties every year. And so it would surprise me if she has abandoned the anti-abortion movement now that she's out of prison, but I'm not aware, and I'm sure she has to be very, very careful because she's certainly under surveillance.
Perhaps she's somewhere knitting.
Knitting. Yes.
So this book was published in 2019. If you were writing an update, which women or anti-abortion organization would you include today?
I think I would do more with groups like the Susan B. Anthony group, with the people who are trying to pluck out feminists from the 19th century and argue that this is the historic way of being a feminist. And a lot of that has been disproven, including about Susan B. Anthony, so I want that to be clear. But I find it really fascinating that this continues to have traction among people like Sarah Palin, Lauren Boebert, like people who in so many ways would not identify with feminism, but are happy to use that label when it comes to anti-abortion activism. It's very interesting to me and suggestive of a way that they are in some way maybe conscious of their own oppression. Maybe.
One of the women that actually stands out a bit in your book, if she gets short mention, is Janet Reno.
Yeah.
it was really only the Clinton administration that took the violence seriously and made roads to prosecute clinic bombers, arsonists, things of those folks.
Yeah.
And pass the FACE Act. So, can you talk a little bit about the history of the government in prosecuting, or not, in most cases, not prosecuting these activists, and then Janet Reno's role?
You know, Amy, I think that is such an interesting question, and I think that a good biography of Janet Reno needs to be written, because it was also Janet Reno who was like the first person to aggressively go after white supremacist organizing, and you know, like, and she was just completely tarnished by Ruby Ridge and by Waco, and she was eviscerated for like going after these groups and causing the violence, but these white supremacist groups had gotten away with behavior that is like remarkably similar, and it's sometimes intersecting with anti-abortion violence. And she was steely in what she did. Like it took guts to do what she did. And again, for years, these clinic owners had begged the federal government to get involved. And really famously, William Webster, who had been the head of the FBI, said something like, and this was during the Reagan administration, we can find no discernible link between these groups, even though like clinic providers offered them mountains of evidence saying like the same person was at my clinic and then the next day was at this clinic, or you know, we have fingerprint evidence that links these people. And so it was Janet Reno who was among the first to really get teeth and to give the teeth of the federal government to come in and protect these clinics, because local police officers often themselves were anti-abortion, so would do very little or turn the other way in the face of.
And we should note that while we're speaking about violence that occurred in the past, it continues today. Just over the summer, the current iteration of Operation Rescue was in Nashville, terrorizing clinics as they do every summer. And clinics continue to experience violence. The Feminist Majority Foundation does a yearly or bi-yearly report on clinic violence, and so it hasn't gone away. And in fact, some folks, advocates, speculate that it will increase now that clinics are closing, and there will be just a few clinics located in the Midwest, on the coasts, that perhaps violence will increase. Do you anticipate that?
Yes, and and I'm gonna kind of answer this in a strange way maybe, but one of the things that I keep thinking about is this escalation of white supremacist violence and anti-government violence. Even yesterday, somebody driving his vehicle into a wall near the Capitol and then shooting himself. I see that in the escalation of white supremacist activism as being part of if it's an octopus or a hydra, a part of something that includes anti-abortion violence. And it is the very same people who are devoted Donald Trump fans who are very anti-abortion. It is all part of the same puzzle. And also, so again, I don't think that we can, if I were to write this book over again, I think I would have more sensitivity to the way in which white supremacy frames anti-abortion violence.
In reading this book, I was as interested in the organizing tactics as I was in the individual women's lives. Aside from the unprecedented violence perpetrated on physicians and clinics, there are some interesting similarities in the anti-abortion and pro-choice movements. Are there any takeaways for pro-choice activists as we consider the movement in a post-Roe landscape?
That is interesting, and I'd almost like to hear your answer more than mine onto that one, just because of all of your experience with pro-choice organizing. But I'll give you just like one thing that I think about a lot, because I teach the Women's History Survey, and one of the things that I teach a lot is civil rights organizing, and how groups like SNCC, which were like younger college kids in relation to like the NAACP, they figured out very early on that if they were going to like have these college-age students go out and put their lives on the line, have food be thrown at them, like incredibly stressful stuff, they needed a release valve. They needed social opportunities that they recognized they were dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds. They needed to have dances and go to movies. and just some way to like have this cohesion and friendship. And that the anti-abortion movement definitely offered this for these women. Like this was an acceptable way for these mothers and wives to leave their houses to go to these events, these women's only retreat, and often they spent the majority of their time complaining about men. Like if men would step up to the plate, women wouldn't need abortions. If men were better husbands and more attentive, women wouldn't be doing bad things. So that it was like this acceptable way to complain about men. And so I wonder if that resonates for you, this idea of like having opportunities to socialize and have fun in the context of being under so much unrelenting stress.
Well, I will keep my answer short since this is really about you, but I would agree that in my own work here in New Orleans with the New Orleans Abortion Fund, we definitely involved and created opportunities for people to get involved through events that were oftentimes very fun, like sex ed bingo or a fashion show or just a regular happy hour. And that was a way for people to come together to talk about an issue that is very stigmatizing, and especially in the Deep South and even here in New Orleans, surprisingly. But also I think that creativity and that approach to the work is reflective of the New Orleans culture. And so I was tapping into what New Orleanians naturally do and adding a layer of activism to it. But certainly being in the same room is going to be important moving forward, I think, and building those relationships. And I have been stressing building trust and rapport, even among activists and folks who are going to be needing our services. Services that are not going to be readily or openly available to people. I think those social spaces are going to be very important. So with that, I want to just open it up to some questions. We have a few people in the room, and so if you have a question, please feel free to ask it, and we'll take it from there.
You were saying if you rewrote the book, you'd explore more about the connection between white supremacy movement and the anti-abortion movement. Can you just speak on that a little bit more?
So one thing that there's another scholar, Carol Mason, who's written about Klansmen who got involved in anti-abortion activism in Florida. And for them, the issue is that they were very anxious about white women having abortions, worried that it was going to drive, the race suicide type theory. Similarly, we know that there's been a really big push to try to convince African Americans to join the movement, saying that like it's a form of Black genocide, which is an old argument. And so it's interesting to me how these two arguments coexist within the movement. And so to me, what I find so fascinating is how like patriarchy is so central to white supremacy, as is to anti-abortion activism, and so it's like just such a natural fit that I think that's worth exploring more.
Can you speak to like the demographics of people who are involved in the like movement? Like, has it changed and it's growing, of course, but is it like becoming more diverse?
It is becoming more diverse, and in particularly among like Latinos, and also among like Filipino immigrants, many of whom like into the California area join evangelical churches. So like as evangelical Christianity is spreading throughout Texas and California, it's bringing in greater diversity into the movement. For much of the period that I studied in this book, it was like very much white dominated, and that was like a source of anxiety for the leaders. Like, how do we do outreach? But like, as if any of you have ever worked on a nonprofit, this will sound familiar to you. Like, they would put like all white people on a committee to figure out how to like, get like Latinos to join the anti-abortion movement, and then like wonder why things didn't materialize.
I'm curious about, I think something that I found pretty shocking after Roe vs. Wade fell was like just the movement on miscarriages and and non-viable pregnancies, and just some of the like kind of really extreme places that it went really fast. So I'm wondering if if the women that you studied if this is like the policy agenda that they're really fighting for, or is this or are things just so chaotic right now, and at some point people will settle to medical ideology first, and I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes
there's been
sense.
a lot of reporting recently in local press how physicians are having difficulty carrying out their jobs. I mean, providing healthcare instead of, they are trained physicians. They know what they ought to provide medically, but are having to check in with the legal department to see if they're afoul of the law, which is not clear to everyone yet. So,
Yep. And in this period of lack of clarity, hospital administrators are prone to taking the most conservative interpretation possible to avoid litigation. And so they're definitely putting anyone who's ever worked for an institution, this will be familiar, they're putting the safety and well-being of the institution above the interests of the patients. But another thing that your question gets at is that there's this long-standing debate within the anti-abortion movement. So most diehard activists want a 100% ban on abortion, no exceptions, because to have exceptions is to reveal a possible hypocrisy, that there are some fetuses that can be aborted and some that can't. So if you want to be logically pure, that is an understandable position. There are other people who have argued there's no way that we're gonna come to the table and win new converts with this 100% no exceptions, not rape, not depending upon the era, no fetal abnormalities and that sort of thing. At one time, the consensus in the United States was that a defective fetus should be aborted. And so the debate was always how do we move politically? Should we allow for some exceptions in order to get some gains, or should we be hardliners? Well, the wind is at their back right now, right? And so they don't really need to moderate. And even the people who do try to moderate, they're tying themselves in knots. There's this one congresswoman from South Carolina who wants to have a rape exception because she herself was raped. But people have pointed out, and the only way that you could that this could go into effect is if a person who's been raped reports their rape and the rapist is found guilty. And journalists have pointed out that she herself didn't report her rape when it happened. If she had become impregnated, she would not have been able to take advantage of the clause or of this exception. And it's she just goes kneeling down because she can't defend this exception. We know that it's unworkable in practice, right?
but aside from the exceptions, I mean, there's been a lot of reporting about how these abortion bans are going to impact healthcare generally. Louisiana already has a very high rate of maternal mortality, infant mortality, and we can only expect that these bans are going to exacerbate that. So, does those sort of issues concern the anti-abortion movement?
No, when they're asked that question, won't this increase the maternal mortality rate? They're told that they believe that we're on the precipice of a culture of supporting life and women. They offer no policies or evidence of how that will be implemented, but they believe that there's a sea change underway of the way that we think about pregnant people, and that will just get solved.
Well, and the solution seems to be the crisis pregnancy centers. I mean, millions of taxpayer dollars are going to support crisis pregnancy centers, which in the past have not been reliable sources of information. Their staff are not trained. Those facilities are not licensed.
Yeah.
Is that really a solution?
The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists would say no. Yeah. I think you've had your hand up for a while. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I did. You talked earlier about interlocking movements and white supremacy and the anti-abortion movement, and I wondered if you had also looked into the QAnon anti-sex trafficking evangelical movement and how there might be some overlap there.
I think there would definitely be overlap in that QAnon appears to be an offshoot of some of these white supremacist groups that are very much rooted in conspiracy theories. And so this is just people who've gone down, their focus has been more on things like vaccine safety, but it's just this general distrust of science and the government and the man in general.
I know the book itself isn't about this completely, but I also know you have a background in this as well. So I'm wondering, so say in an ideal scenario, keep fighting and keep working, and there's some rethinking of what the legalization of abortion would look like. I'm interested in your thoughts around like the privacy thing that was in the Supreme Court versus sort of the reproductive justice model of human right, and what would be an, I hate to say this, but coming one day, hopefully coming out of this, what might be an ideal scenario of the ways in which it could be much more codified and solidified, and the framework and what that might look like. Do you have thoughts on that?
Okay, so there's this long-standing debate about like if Roe was a poorly written decision, because at its heart, it argued that abortion was a right to privacy, and the criticism, including by people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was that the word privacy doesn't appear in the Constitution, ergo, it's always been vulnerable to attack. So a lot of legal scholars, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, have always said like it should include language that's actually there, like equal protection. Like in order for women to enjoy equal protection under the law, they need to have this right, or due process. I think that's all garbage because I think that these anti-abortion people would have gone after a pro-choice law no matter what it said. Like I don't think they were like, the word privacy isn't in the Constitution, ha ha ha. Like that's not the way that this went down. And also when we look at this Kansas vote, why is it that so many Republicans voted against this measure to say that our Constitution, or that the Supreme Court was wrong in interpreting our Constitution as protecting abortion rights? Because they thought it was gross that the government was getting so much involved in people's personal lives. So like even these like very conservative Republicans, they were articulating in defense of privacy, saying like I deserve privacy. The government doesn't belong here. That's weird. And the Democrats in Kansas articulated a very similar refrain. So I think we need to be careful about thinking that privacy is a bad way of going about this. I actually think that that resonates with a lot of Americans, that they think it's weird and gross for the government to care about personal medical decisions. But what I do think needs to happen, or something that could be robust, is like look at what's been effective in Minnesota. This just got upheld. Look what happened in Kansas. It's saying our Constitution guarantees a protection for the right to abortion. So Congress needs, I don't care how they phrase it, but they need to say Americans have a right to abortion that is guaranteed by our Constitution. That's what would have, that I think right now that's the only lever that could go up against the Supreme Court is Congress enacting a federal act to protect abortion rights. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you so much for coming. I so appreciate you being here on a Sunday afternoon. I want to invite everyone to come up to the front as we finish and purchase a book, have it signed. And again, thanks for folks who were on social media. We'll be back here at Blue Cypress Books in New Orleans on September 26th with Robin Marty, author of Handbook for Post-Roe America, when we continue the conversation.
Thank you, Amy.